Right, I feel like we put that expectation very high. It's been a long day sitting and listening to talks, very fascinating talks, but it's been a long day, so I appreciate everyone coming in here for one more talk. I will say, I can promise there are no bullet points, no graphs in my PowerPoint. And I'm going to tell some story. So hopefully it'll be fun. If you look at, I tell people that I've written a book about the history and science of bird migration. Sounds kind of dry. That's it's really entertaining and weird and funny. So I'm just going to tell some stories. My name is Heisman. I live in Eastern Washington, so about as far from Seattle as you can be in Washington. And I'm a freelance translator, specifically a freelance bird writer. It turns out that is something you can make a living doing. So I, at one point, I was going to be an ornithologist, and then figured out that I was much happier writing about and talking about other people's research than actually being in charge of doing research myself. Luckily, figured that out before I started a PhD program. And yeah, I'm here tonight. Now I write for places like the Cornell Ornithology magazine and Audubon sometimes, and the American Bird Conservancy. And the reason I'm here tonight is that I have also written a book about, is this thing gonna work for me? Yes, about migration research. I have spent the last 2 or 3 years of my life. I have read way more scientific papers than I can count. The note section of this book is. I have talked to dozens, not just ornithologists, but also a surprising number of electrical engineers, video scientists, and geochemists, and a philosopher at this point. I've joined a few scientists in the field, which is a lot of fun. And I just feel really privileged that this is my job, and my job is telling stories about birds and about the people who love them. It's a really great job to have because there are so many good stories about fish. So these are just a few of the amazing migrators and stories that are in my book. I'm sure some of you are familiar with these. They're talking about the plant. I mean, that's very good. So much to show me. All right. Cool, I can use that. Let's right. Let's know all the birds already. But this here, of course, is the bar-tailed godwit, which was in the know that one. So nonstop flight from Alaska to New Zealand in the fall, which is what's around my head around the fact that there's a bird that flies now across the Pacific Ocean. This is the bar-headed goose, which migrates over the top of the Himalayan mountains, one of the highest altitude bird migrations in the world. And then up towards that little black warbler, which in the fall, this guy spends 3 days flying over the open waters of the Western Atlantic Ocean on its way from New England down to South America, which doesn't sound funny. Bar-tailed godwit size until you remember that a bar-tailed godwit is like the size of a football, and a black-polled warbler weighs about the same as a ballpoint pen. Mind-boggling. So yeah, birds really amazing things, but to me, what's just as fascinating as what migrating birds do and how they fit is how we figured all of this out. And that's my book is really about. It's not how bird migration per se, as about how we learned about bird migration. And that's what I'm here to talk about tonight. I do want to get a little bit more background about me and how I came to write this book. Before the pandemic, I worked full-time for the American Ornithological Society, which so far most of the talk of the bird watching groups, and I have to explain what that is, but I don't think I need to tell you all. It's AOS, formerly AOU. I was their communications department. Or work. But one of the biggest parts of my job was doing publicity for the research being published in their journals, which at that time were called the Author the Condor. I won't share with you my opinion about the fact that they've changed his names. So I was reading lots of new research coming out, and I was talking to the scientists behind it, and I was writing press releases and blog posts about all this. And again, for bird watching audiences, we would talk a little bit about the structure of the scientific paper. You guys will read scientific papers, know what they're like. So I was reading all these papers, and I kept getting hung up on the part that I think a lot of people kind of skim through quickly to get to the good stuff in the discussion, which is the methods. I kept getting really stuck on it's kind of a good way, like fascinated by the method sections of all these papers because I didn't know, or if I had learned in an undergraduate ornithology class I had forgotten, that you can study migration using weather radar or using recordings of nocturnal flight calls of birds passing overhead. There was a talk earlier today about acoustic monitoring, or by analyzing the amounts of rare hydrogen isotopes in bird feathers. And I just kept thinking, how does this work? And who figured this out? Who figured out that this was possible? And so when COVID came along, I ended up leaving that job. A lot of people, had upheavals in their employment situation around that time. And so I decided to go ahead and write a proposal. And that's the book that a lot of you have copies of. It's not a scholarly book. It's not necessarily meant to be comprehensive history of every major paper ever written using one of these techniques. It's mostly just to kind of give you the flavor of the history of the stuff and then people think it all out. And so in doing this, I was joining a really long tradition. People have been wondering about bird migration and trying to figure out what is going on with the birds when they appear and disappear at different times of the year for a really long time. Going all the way back to this guy. Anything else to this is? Aristotle. Yeah. Aristotle was, as far as I know, the first guy to write down a theory about what was going on when birds disappeared at some times of the year and reappeared at other times of the year. He didn't get it right. He thought that maybe when swallows disappeared in the fall, they might be like hibernating in tree bark crevices. He thought that maybe the common red starts we saw in summer transformed into European robins in winter. While I didn't know about birds that change their plumage pretty dramatically between times of the year. It's not weird. Approaching him that maybe all of this going on was just the birds were moving in and out of the area. But my first wrong theory about what's the deal with birds moving around comes from the 17th century. You're not, or you know what's about to come next. English ministry educator in the 17th century named Charles Morton, who wrote this big long treatise about theory of what was the deal with birds. He thought that when they disappeared in fall, they were going to the moon. Made how fast birds could fly. Underestimated how far it was to the moon. Like she wasn't really aware of the whole problem of breathing oxygen. But he got a few things right. He could speculate that changes in the weather and the food supply might spur birds to move on to new places. And he thought that maybe body fat accumulation was what helped fuel them on their journey to the moon. And now we all know that is actually a big part of how birds physiologically are for migration by putting on body fat. First real so what was really going on was the birds were flying back and forth between continents, came around in 1822. Okay, I'm seeing some nods. Yeah. So this was stork that was shot in Germany in 1822. And the guy who shot it went to pick it up and discovered he did not shoot it with that spear, he shot it with a gun. This to his surprise, it had an enormous spear through its neck that it had probably been flying around with for quite some time. It was eventually a newspaper in the area paid to have the wood and iron in the spear analyzed and determined that this spear had been made in Africa. So this very unlucky stork seemed that I got from Africa were triggered well enough to fly all the way back to Germany only to be shot by another hunter. Shit for the stork, but it was like I said, it was the first really concrete evidence that what's actually going on is the birds are flying long distances between the seasons. Germans like to make up new compound words for everything. So they called this the file stork, which means arrow stork, and it's been taxidermy. It's on display in the Natural History Museum in Rostock, Germany. You can go visit it if you want to. This basically sort of touched off the modern study of migration, if you will, ever since people have been trying to figure out where birds go and when and why. In my book, I cover a lot of ground. The book starts out with the early history of bird banding in North America, and it goes all the way up through machine learning and high volume genetic sequencing and this sort of thing, basically covering all of the major ways that people have studied bird migration over time. But when I started thinking about how on earth I was going to adapt that into a 45-minute talk, I decided that the easiest and most fun thing would be to just zoom in on 3 of my favorite stories from the book. So I'm going to talk about 3 of my favorite characters from the history of bird migration research. And I will say I intentionally picked the more historical stories from the book instead of the more contemporary stories because I never wanted to get into a situation where I was talking about someone who might be in the audience. They're for the audience to appear in the book. So that just seemed too awkward. So at the end of this talk, you'll come away with a new appreciation. I don't have to tell you guys this, but this is written for bird watching audiences, so excuse me. But you'll come away with a new appreciation of all of the hard work and creativity that goes into every like cool gee-whiz soundbite facts that you hear about bird migration. So the first technique I'm going to talk about for studying what's the deal with bird migration is one that I hadn't even heard of when I started doing my research, which was moon watching. So a lot of birds migrate at night, which means that if you want to see what they're doing, you can't just look up and see them flying overhead because it's dark. And there's a lot of ways to see what's going on with birds that migrate at night, like radar. But back before all that technology was developed, it was a lot harder. And so this guy, George Lowry, came up with a really simple way to study nocturnal bird migration using just a telescope. Are you familiar with George Lowry? Couple people? Okay. So George Lowry was born, was an ornithologist who was born in Louisiana in 1913. And he was fascinated by birds from a very young age. In 1936, he finished his master's degree from the University of Louisiana in Baton Rouge, and he stayed there for the rest of his career. He founded a museum of zoology there, and he stayed on to work at the museum and teach and study birds. I think at one point he was somewhere else to get his PhD, and he came over. So looking along the coast of Louisiana and being interested in birds, he would have been very, very familiar with the phenomenon of migratory fallout, where birds flying north across the Gulf of Mexico in spring, depending on the weather conditions, they all just sort of fall out of the sky at the first bit of land that they see. You can see trees just filled with clouds of all different species of migrating songbirds. And in the first half of the 20th century, ornithologists thought that it was the birds did migrate across the Gulf of Mexico on a regular basis, based on the evidence that was available. But he didn't have any way to prove it. And in the 1940s, another George, and George Williams came along. He noticed these papers arguing that there was no way trans-Gulf migration was real. He thought that the idea was ridiculous. Like, why do birds voluntarily fly across 500 miles of open ocean when Mexico is right there? So his argument was the birds be going up the coast of Mexico. We don't remember we ever saw large numbers of birds there because we must just not be looking hard enough. They're flying too high and too fast, and they're sticking to a narrow route. It's the only thing that makes sense. They must be doing this. Now, George Lowry read these papers, and having seen fallout on the coast of Louisiana, he was really annoyed with the skyline. And he's thinking about how he might do this. And he remembers his sort of weird, quirky ornithology papers from the very beginning of the 20th century that he had read, where ornithologists described being able to see the silhouettes of birds passing in front of the full moon at night during migration. And so Lowry thought maybe he could do something with that. And luckily for him, there was an astronomer also working at this university in Baton Rouge at the time who was really into birds. He was a big bird. So Lowry and this astronomer worked together, and they came up with a series of equations that you could use to take the raw counts of the number of things that you saw passing in front of the moon in a certain amount of time, and do a bunch of math and turn that into an estimate of how many birds must be crossing an imaginary 1 mile line on the Earth's surface every hour, which is kind of abstract. What it meant was that he had a way to directly compare the amount of migration going on at one time and place with the amount of migration going on in another time and place, which he really had a good way to do before. And so he's like, all right, I've got it. This is how I'm going to prove George Williams wrong. I'm going to do it. April 1945, Lowry gets on a boat, headed out across the Gulf of Mexico for the Yucatan Peninsula with a telescope off up. And so they're out on the open waters of the Gulf the first night. Here we go. He goes up on deck, he sets up his telescope, he points at the moon, he looks through it. Yeah. And he didn't have a lot of succeed. He hadn't he could see with his telescope because the moon would constantly just be bobbing and spinning out of sight. He spent the trip, which took a few days. recording every bird that he happened to see flying past the ship during the daytime. And then finally, when they docked on the Yucatan, they were in a place that was much calmer. And so he tried again. He set his telescope back up and he pointed it out across the Gulf of Mexico. And I think in 45 minutes, he counted about 12 birds, which doesn't sound like a whole lot. But when he did the math, it worked out to about 3,700 birds passing across this imaginary 1-mile line extending out into the Gulf every hour. So he's collecting the first really hard evidence that trans-Gulf migration, which we're all familiar with now, was real. And he was just getting started. He's like, he knew that he had stumbled onto a tool that had a lot of potential. And so his next idea was that he wanted to scale this up and recruit volunteers all over North America to do these counts at the same time so that he could get a continent-wide snapshot of migration patterns, which nothing like that had ever been done before at the time. And now we would use the term citizen science or community science to describe the project involving recruiting a lot of volunteers to collect data. Those terms hadn't existed yet. He was sort of making this up as he went along. He wasn't going to be able to do a giant project like this by himself. And luckily for him, right around this time, a new graduate student arrived at LSU. So this is Bob Newman. So this is a photo taken later in his career. People tend to get more photos of them taken later on when they become famous. So I couldn't find any photos of young Bob. Because he arrived at LSU as a young man right around this, and started working with Lowry. And like Lowry, he allowed his graduate student stayed for the rest of his career to work in the museum and he never left. And both of these men passed away quite a while ago, so I didn't get to interview either of them when I was working on the book, but I did get to talk to someone who worked with both of them when he was a grad student at LSU. And it sounds like in a lot of ways, they couldn't have been more different. Lowry was sort of an old school gentleman naturalist who would have been pretty at home in the 19th century. You know, he wore a suit and tie for field work. He was, I mean, really a home thing, so everyone did at that time, but it's a pretty fundamental image. He was like, you know, he was a school naturalist. He had really broad interests. He actually wrote a book about the mammals of Louisiana. In addition to being an ornithologist, he, you know, organized expeditions to South and Central America all the time to gather more specimens for the museum. He was a workaholic who would go home to have dinner with his wife and then sneak back to the museum to get a few more hours of work in the evening. On the other hand, had a reputation for his sense of humor. He was a jokester. He likes some practical jokes. He also approached problems a lot more like a modern scientist. He taught himself statistics at a time when that was not a common skill for zoologists. He did not have to know statistics to be a zoologist. And he made it a personal mission to keep up with the latest bird migration research. Together, they set about carrying out Lowry's plan to collect this continent-wide snapshot of migration patterns. Well before the internet, it was before computers. There might have been a handful of primitive computers in the country at the time, but they didn't have any access to them. And so to do this, they spent as much as 12 hours a day handwriting letters to potential volunteers all over the country, spelling out the great contribution that they would be making to science if they would be willing to count birds for a telescope passing across the moon in fall. We eventually recruited, it's 300 and some volunteers from like 2,500 locations all across the continent. Make sure that this went well and everyone was following the standard procedure and collected as good data as they possibly could. They even went as far as publishing a how-to pamphlet with instructions on how to collect this data and with some tips on how to stay comfortable during long segments. This is an actual figure from their house pamphlets. This is definitely one of the more bizarre things. Research. But I can't decide though. So Newman did have a reputation for his sense of humor. It tended to be amusing, or this was just, you know, what squire the lounge pants. I don't know, but this was just their advice on how you should prepare yourself for any sort of moon watching. So finally, in fall 1952, telescopes swung into action all across North America. People went out, looked up at the moon, counted birds, filled out their data sheets, sent it off to Lowry and Newman in Louisiana. But now, as paper data sheets poured in from all corners of the continent, stacking up higher and higher and higher on their desks, they realized that they had a problem that they hadn't really thought through about as much as maybe they should have beforehand, which is how they were going to analyze all this data. So again, this was before computers, and this was before most zoologists had really any statistical training to speak of. They now needed to calculate the average direction and volume of bird migration from these hundreds of locations around the country. They wanted to look for patterns relating this to what was going on with the weather. So they had to look up the weather data for all of these locations and dates. They had to depict any patterns that they found that they were going to find on easy to interpret maps, and they would have to draw those maps by hand. 14 years. So in 1966, they finally published their magnum opus, a continent-wide view of bird migration on 4 nights in October. Okay, what's fun? Yeah. 4 nights, exactly. It's 40 pages long. It was a huge blockbuster. It was published in the Op, which coincidentally is one of the same journals that I will be working for about 50 years later. And it included these maps. I don't know what all this sweeping around it has. This is from, I don't know if that's an artifact from when it was scanned or what. They used these black and red arrows to depict how much migration was going on in different locations and these gray swoops or weather fronts and whatnot. And it's never been done before. I feel like now it's easy to take this sort of thing for granted, but at the time, being able to see what was going on with bird migration on one night all across the continent was totally new. Nothing like this had been done before. And they could see these massive migratory flights that span multiple seas, and they could see that they were related to what was going on with wind and cold fronts. Now, I think a lot of you are probably familiar with checking the weather forecast during migration season because we all know that bird migration kind of drives these advancements. No one had ever been able to see that quite like this before. So this paper was, like I said, it was 40 pages long. It was amazing. It influenced studies of bird migration for years to come. This was the last moon watching paper that Lowry and was. But we did other work before this with it. Like Lowry's thing where he took a telescope across the Gulf of Mexico. But this is the last moon watching paper, even though it was the biggest one. So I'll tell you why in just a second. You can be thinking about what this is. I just a couple photos to share. This on the left is me sharing that moon watching in my driveway with the bio telescope. I saw one thing that I thought might have been a bird, but I wasn't totally sure. It looks like I quickly saw why the tips on getting comfortable were necessary because training over an eyepiece, staring at the full moon, which is really bright, kind of uncomfortable basically. And then picture. Yeah. So it's like it to be arranged by that. And on the right here, there's some folks now who are trained to bring back moon watching by automating it using video cameras. And if I remember correctly, I think the goal is to use machine learning to automatically know the birds that pass in front of their. They had plans to continue this. They had applied for a new grant to study the behavior of birds arriving across the Gulf, and they had plans for how they could adapt their methods for use in daylight for study day migrating species. But moon watching was about to be made and it's completely obsolete very quickly by the arrival of a new technology. Does anyone know what that would have been? Red radar. So I'm sure you've all seen images like this before. This is from the nationwide weather radar system, the same one that we all see images from on the Weather Channel showing where rain is going on. There is rain on this map. It's this stuff over here on the East Coast. But I'm sure you all know what all these round blobs. Birds, yes. When you see radar images on the Weather Channel, they're filtering out all the non-weather stuff. Actually show up really well on weather radar. And the only reason they show up as those circles represents the field of view of one individual radar station. And there's just such a huge volume of birds out there during migration that when they lift off in the evening, they just fill the entire field of view of each individual station. So you see them as these sort of donuts going all down the continent. Yeah, it's really cool. Now, when radar first came into use, though, no one had really thought about the fact that birds might show up on it. When radar first became used regularly, it wasn't for weather. It was World War II. Yeah. So I'm going to get technical for just a second here. You guys, I'm sure, probably know a lot of this already, but radar stands for radio detection and ranging. The way it works is like sonar or echolocation, except with radio waves instead of sound. So a special kind of transmitter is beaming out radio waves. They're bouncing off objects we'll do that once I usually you're kind of bouncing off objects from the path and coming back. And based on the direction and image coming back, you can figure out something about what sort of objects might be out there. So in 1935, British scientists using just a regular radio transmitter owned by the BBC had already shown that they could use this method to detect planes in the air up to 8 miles away. And by the time World War II officially got started, Great Britain had already built a whole network of radar stations looking down the British coast to watch for planes driving across the English Channel from the European mainland. But as these radar stations started operating, the people in charge of them started picking up these weird signals. They didn't know what they were. Planes sort of plod along at a predictable speed and trajectory, but they picked these weird things that would sort of wax and wane and change direction unexpectedly. Supposedly, at one point, British fighter planes were urgently ordered into the air to intercept strange signals arriving across the English Channel and got up there and there was nothing there. They couldn't figure out what these were, and so exasperated radar operators, so they're calling these things radar angels. Now, while all this is going on, this guy, whose name is David Black, and again, young man then, this is a photo taken from later in his career, was teaching science at a school in Devonshire in southwestern England. Even though he was now basically a high school science teacher, he had a background in ornithology. He studied ornithology at Cambridge. In 1938, he took a year off from his teaching job to go study Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands. And he arrived back in England just as war was breaking out. And he later wrote a little bit of a memoir about the early years of his career. And so I want to read you a little bit of how he describes what happened when he got back to England on the brink of war. I'm a pacifist at the age of 17, so he pledged himself to a pacifist organization, an anti-war organization in the UK. And in the autumn of 1940, I decided that I ought to leave my job at the school to work with a pacifist unit. I spent a trial night in the East End of London during heavy raids, but was put off by the pacifist earnest attitudes and by the flashes and bangs, but I was immediately converted from pacifism. I know, right? When the French Register for Scientific Workers sent me to interview for an unspecified job, because if you had a science degree, they wanted to give you a science job. As a biologist, you will of course have learned a lot of physics, the interviewer said. I'm afraid not, I answered. It's math with a high standard. Very doubtfully, travel will often entail going out in the wet and cold in the dark. Would you mind that? Not at all. I was later set off from London with 19 other biologists on a mystery coach tour. So you can see where this was going. He was assigned to work on radar. Because even though his degree had nothing to do with radar, like everyone with any sort of science background was being put to work on these stuff because they needed any warm body they could get. His first working was the Quirky, which are remote, windy, wet group of islands off the northern end of Scotland. And I think he was probably the only person to be sent to the Quirky. The birding was really good. He spent all of his off hours scrambling around in the rocks looking for puffins and skuas on a radar installations up and down the coast. And it was at that time that he was reintroduced to an old classmate of his from Cambridge named Jordan Varley. Varley was an entomologist by training, but again, anyone with any scientific degree was apparently being put to work on radar at this point. And it was really introduced Black to the problem of the so-called radar angels that was plaguing the radar operators. Now, David Black was a bird guy by training. He heard the description of these signals and what they looked like on radar, and he pretty much immediately had him take back into what must be going on. It's like, they must be birds. All those experts said that was impossible. And so he and Varley about proving that radar angels were actually birds. They created, at one point, they convinced an officer to tie a dead gull to a balloon and send it up into the air in the path of a radar station just to prove that birds could at least theoretically make a radar signal. And then in September 1941, they finally managed to trap in real time a flock of gannets offshore using a telescope while also tracking them on the radars. So proved for the first time that yes, this radar signal was gannets. As the war went on, they continued collecting observations of what they thought were birds showing up on radar. And the technology was advancing really quickly. So at the beginning of the war, they could only pick up big birds like gannets and geese, and pretty soon they were picking up flocks of starlings and things. There was still a lot of skeptics, so I want to read you one more quick quote from David Lack, who clearly had a sense of humor. At one meeting, after the physicists had again gravely explained the clouds of ions must be responsible, Hartley with equal gravity accepted their view, provided that the ions were wrapped in feathers. Before all of this was top secret, but in 1945, they finally got permission to publish a summary of their findings in Nature, and basically touched off the whole subfield of radar ornithology, because for the first time, the wider ornithological community became aware that it was possible to protect birds using radar, and this immediately generated a lot of interest. Today, Lack, who died in the 1970s, is better remembered for his work on Darwin's finches than he is for this, but this was apparently, this was basically the beginning of radar ornithology. Ornithology might have died a early death if not for the fact that after the war, radar very quickly got adopted by meteorologists because hurricanes show up as well on radars, planes and birds do. And so very soon there was a large nationwide network of radar stations set up, which was great news for ornithologists. And over the years, as radar technology has gotten better, new advancements like the introduction of Doppler radar have made it better, has made it possible to collect better and better data on migrating birds. And one of the papers using this data that I find most impressive was published in 2018 by some folks affiliated with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. They downloaded weather radar scans representing every evening for 23 years, so 150,000 individual radar scans. And they did a whole bunch of math, analyzing this to see how weather factors like temperature and wind and air pressure predicted the appearance of big migration movements on radar. So they were basically doing the same thing that George Lowry and Bob Newman were trying to do with moon watching, but now they had a lot more data and they had computers to help them do it. Their math explained almost 80% of the variation in migration intensity from night to night, just using weather and radar data. And even cooler, they could predict the appearance of big migration movements several days in advance. So if any of you have ever used Birdcast, which is the forecast service put out by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where you can log on and see when the next big migratory movement is going to happen, that's the technology that this is based on, and it's all thanks to a witty science teacher from Devonshire. Bravo. So I'm not quite done yet. Radar, of course, is not the only way to put radio waves to work tracking birds. And that brings me to my third and favorite migration maverick that I'm going to talk about tonight. And I know there's some folks in the audience that knew this man quite well. So I hope I'm going to do him justice. This is my friend. This is a photo of him as a younger guy on the left, and then later in his career on the right. So in the 1950s, Bill Cochran was a young Navy veteran working on an electrical engineering degree part-time while also working for a brand new television station based in Champaign, Illinois. One morning, he went out to check on his employer's transmitter tower at the edge of town. And after 6 in the morning, he got out there and he found a guy walking around picking up dead birds. The man that he met was named Richard Graber, and he was an ornithologist who was studying the phenomenon of tower kills, which is where flocks of birds fly into communications towers and are killed. And Bill Cochran was fascinated by this. He didn't know that people did this sort of thing. And pretty soon he was spending his spare time sort of tinkering together gadgets for Richard Graber to help him in his work. Bill Cochran appears in more chapters of my book than any other individual researcher. The first project that he worked on with Richard Graber was figuring out a way to record nocturnal flight calls. So we heard a little bit about passive acoustic monitoring earlier. Cochran and Graber were the first people to actually record the nocturnal flight calls of birds passing overhead at night. And they wanted to be able to record a whole 8-hour night in one go. So it was Cochran who figured out how to rig up a tape recorder with a bicycle axle to hold these 1,000 feet of. They would need to do this in the pre-digital era. But the chapter in my book where Bill Cochran looms largest is definitely the one on radio telemetry. So this is the only cover that we very tall, but it's a photo of the replica of the first transistor. It's the invention of the transistor in 1847 that made radio telemetry really feasible. Telemetry just means transmitting data from one place to another in real time. Before the transistor, radios relied on vacuum tubes to amplify the signals that they were producing to send out. And vacuum tubes were bulky and unreliable. They tended to blow out a lot. anyone who owned a television in the vacuum tube era had to be really good at replacing them because they just failed all the time. Transistors, without getting into the weeds about how they work, basically they provided a more lightweight and efficient and durable and elegant way of doing the same thing, which means that all of a sudden it was possible to adapt radios for all sorts of tasks that they wouldn't have been very practical before. The US Navy was one of the first groups to jump on this, and very soon the Navy was trying out things like transmitting the vital signs of the jet pilot to someone monitoring them on the ground in real time, or using this to test out how effective cold water suits the sailors were by transmitting data on the temperature inside the suits. It did not take very long, however, for wildlife biologists to start borrowing some of these ideas. So in 1957, some scientists in Antarctica used the cold water suit system to monitor the temperature of a penguin egg during incubation. That's what's going on here in Quirky. That same year, a group of researchers in Maryland borrowed some ideas from the jet pilot project and successfully implanted transmitters in woodchucks to monitor their movement because they moved around in a small area. Soon, big engineering firms like Honeywell were getting involved, trying to develop a wildlife telemetry system that they could market to wildlife biologists to use to monitor the movements of animals. But they were basically trying to do things like put all the components of the radio transmitter in a metal box and strap a metal box onto the back of a grouse and split off into the bushes. When a grouse with a large metal box strapped to its back is not going to last very long. This does not work very well. For wildlife telemetry to really get going, he's literally going to have to think outside the box. Sorry. That one was going to be Bill Cochran. So the next main point in Bill Cochran's career came along in 1957, the same year as the woodchuck and penguin experiments, when Sputnik was launched. The transistor was one thing. Now I have a picture of Sputnik. So by 1960, the launch of Sputnik basically touched off a whole new interest in radios and specifically sending radios up into space, because anyone anywhere on the Earth with a radio could pick up the deep beats from this thing. And so in 1960, Cochrane, who's not actually finished his electrical engineering degree, but was apparently really good with transistors, got another part-time job working for a radio astronomer at the University of Illinois who was working on radio beacons that were going to be sent up on some of the first US satellites. Cochrane was also worked with Richard Graeber and his ornithology buddies. When it wasn't too long before someone suggested combining Cochrane's two part-time jobs. So like, try putting one of the transmitters and see what happens. And so they got a dock from the field station and sent it over to the satellite lab and strapped a transmitter onto this thing using a metal band across its chest. And although they hadn't really planned it this way, it turned out that as the duck breathed, the band across its chest was distorted in a way that they could pick up when they were and so they could actually track its respiratory rate. And when they released this duck without even needing to, they ended up collecting some of the first data on the vital signs of a bird in flight. And this was the beginning of the rest of Bill Cochrane's career. This was what he spent the rest of his life doing, was building transmitters for wildlife and following animals around. So the first project that he really worked on was for Illinois Natural History Survey biologists who wanted a better way to survey the local cottontail rabbit population. And so Cochrane put together some transmitters for him that weighed a third of an ounce and had a range of up to 2 miles, which was really good. To build a transmitter that an animal's going to wear, you're making a trade-off among a long list of factors. You guys all know this. A bigger battery is going to give you a longer lifespan. A longer antenna will let you transmit data further. And then it's heavier, and so you have to get this balance just right. And Bill Cochrane turned out to be really ridiculous. Cochrane himself did not initially realize the significance of what he had just managed until the biologist that he had worked with gave a presentation at a mammalogy conference in 1961, and Cochrane suddenly found himself inundated with job offers from biologists. Now, I think a lot of other would have tried to patent the things that they were inventing or get themselves a high-paying job at one of these engineering firms or otherwise figure out a way to make a lot of money from this. Not Bill Cochrane. He, in fact, took the opposite route, and anyone who wanted to learn how to do this was invited to come stay in his guest and work with him in his garage workshop and learn how to do this stuff. So as the next couple of years went by, he was getting better and better at this and building smaller and smaller transmitters. And by 1965, he had gotten them down to a size where they could safely be worn by a large bird. Now, this is before Modis, although I should say Bill Cochrane also did build the first automated radio telemetry system. So Modis also owes a debt to Bill Cochrane. But at this point, if you wanted to see what was going on with an animal, you had to stay within range of a transmitter. So if they wanted to use one of these things on a migrating bird, they didn't have to be able to follow that bird if it took off. And so Richard Graeber, Bill Cochran's old ornithologist study, was like, all right, no problem, we'll get a plane. So they called this plane the porcupine because of all the antennas sticking out of it. May 1965, they caught a gray cheek thrush outside of Garnet, Illinois. They trimmed the feathers off of its back and they stuck a transmitter on there using eyelash glue. Shape of eyelash glue that you use to attach false eyelashes is really good for this because it doesn't reach the skin, and after a while it wears off and the transmitter will fall off on its own. So I do love the mental image of generations of crusty macho wildlife biologists having to learn exactly where the eyelash glue is at the local drugstore. So they stick a transmitter on this bird, they wait for it to take off with dust, and Graeber and a pilot take off in their small plane, and they follow the bird for 400 miles before turning back, including 2 miles over the open water of Lake Michigan. They couldn't, of course, they were just sitting in the cockpit, flying through the dark, listening to beep, beep, beep at this thing. And Rich Graeber, the ornithologist working on this, was so awed by this experience that he later compared it to how he felt watching the coverage of the Apollo moon missions. Look, Cochran, he was just getting started. So in 1973, Bill Cochran and the student that he was working with touched another thrush in Illinois and put a tag on it. Bird from Illinois up across the border into Canada in a station wagon with a hole cut in the top for the radio receiver. They had some really wild adventures doing this sort of thing. At one point, the student who was driving Cochrane basically spent the night in jail because a suspicious police officer somewhere in Minnesota pulled them over. Who wouldn't be suspicious of seeing this thing die through their little town in Minnesota? It was nighttime. The bird was continuing to fly. They didn't want to stop and lose the bird. So my understanding is that Cochrane basically kicked the other guy out of the car and was like, okay, you two here and sort this out. Kept driving until the bird sat down and gone, doubled back, picked up his companion, and then kept on going. And at this point, they caught some sort of stomach flu, but they didn't want to stop and see a doctor and lose the bird, so they just sucked it out and kept going. Eventually, the engine of the car gave out after they crossed into Canada. And so I don't know that cars, the carburetor, there we go. They finally beep disappeared into the distance and had to give up and turn back. What was about this? It was all written up in a very dry 2-page scientific paper that gave no thanks of all the inventions involved. They were able to stick with this bird so long, gathering data on the exact heading that it took off on each evening, that they were able to track how its direction that it set off on each night changed, its position changed relative to magnetic north. So basically, we're able to show this is some of the first field evidence that birds were using for this magnetic field. And Dave, last night, that slide that you showed you of the peregrine falcon being followed from Wisconsin down into Mexico, that was Bill Cochran. That was one of his good adventures. So if you keep doing this for the rest of his career, there are more Bill Cochran stories than I can possibly tell you. Everyone I meet who met Bill Cochran regales me with more Bill Cochran stories. He always remained a little bit of an outsider in academia. He was an engineer. He wasn't a biologist. He never really got the hang of the politics of academia or of the peer review system. And eventually in the 90s, he left the Illinois Natural History Survey on what I gather were not the greatest of terms. It sounds like he was maybe not the easiest person to get along with, even though he was a genius. But he kept building radio systems for ornithologists in his garage right at the beginning of the century. Like I said, there's some books here tonight you need to go and work with him. But also one more quick story. He was the first person to propose the idea of tracking wildlife by satellite. This was in the 1960s. He was drinking beers at a conference, reminiscing about his work on the radio transmitter beacons for satellites. And was like, yeah, designs are so good. You could put one of my radios and I grab it on a satellite and be able to pick it up from Earth. With a light bulb on that you could also do it the other way around and get the transmitter in space. And as far as thinking this idea of NASA, they shut him down. I think his ideas were ahead of where the technology was. The satellite telemetry wouldn't really get going for another decade. Plus, I think NASA was a little bit preoccupied in the 60s with space. It was Bill's idea. I had the great good fortune of speaking to Bill on the phone multiple times And just in his home in Illinois with a station wagon was still in the driveway, and most of his backyard was taken up with an enormous radio tower. Way last year at the age of 90. So if you open up the opening pages of the book, you'll see that it's partially dedicated in memory of him. But he's really not well known and appreciated as he should be, basically, given that he was basically the father of wildlife telemetry. And so I'm really happy that this book will hopefully bring some of the things that are being accomplished to a wider audience. So I'm almost done. I swear I'm coming to the end of my talk. I apologize to those of you who I'm putting asleep. And in the few minutes that I have left here, I want to really quick talk about connectivity, which this audience is more familiar with than some of the audiences that I've spoken to, and about why all this matters. Before I do that, though, I do want to take a moment just to acknowledge the guys that I've talked about have in common. They're all white dudes, right? Yeah. It's part function of the fact that I intentionally chose some historical stories to talk about tonight. But ornithology is still really white and male dominated. If you look around the room, we've made progress on this, especially and with women getting involved, but there's still a lot more progress to be made. So I think all of us who work in this field, including you who write about this field for a living, have a responsibility to keep engaging with that fact and keep doing what we can to invite more people into this field and make sure that it's a welcoming space for everyone. But so if you get a chance to read my whole book, you will meet some really cool women, and especially women of color who are working using some of these techniques. But you'll also, so these are all the historical stories. As I said, I do cover in the book up to the more contemporary stuff too, the Bird Genoscape Project and stable isotopes and eBird status and trends and all of these things. And so the technology is getting better and better and better all the time. We're able to collect more and more detailed data to figure out what is going on with migratory birds. And that's a good thing because birds are in trouble. Oh, yeah. So migratory connectivity, this is part you guys already know. I'm talking to bird watchers who don't know. Forgive me for getting a little bit jumbled. It's the end of a long day. But the migratory connectivity, as of course you know, is basically just the geographic links between different parts of a bird's annual cycle. So if we have an imaginary bird population with an eastern breeding population, a magical bird species with an eastern breeding population to the western breeding population, migratory connectivity, if they're all just kind of commingling everywhere and they have south for the winter, this is what we call strong migratory connectivity. If they kind of stay separate and these birds that go in one place and these birds that go in another place. And this is actually really important because this is the level of detail that we need to target conservation. So those are what I was supposed to say, and that's a good thing because as we all know, migratory birds are in trouble. This is the famous 3 billion birds paper that's already been referenced a few times today, showing that there are about 3 billion birds, fewer in North America now than there were in 1970. And so when I came to write a conclusion for my book and I somehow needed to tie a bow on this whole thing, I was thinking about whether some of these new tracking technologies are an answer that might help us solve this problem. And I'm looking first for examples where there was a smoking gun where tracking technology had found some new threat or new key location for a species that had led directly to conservation action. I found a few examples, but I didn't find as many as I was thinking that I would. So my next step was to just call up a few of the current leading thinkers in migratory bird conservation, one of whom is Pete Mara, who's one of the senior authors on this paper and who's now co-leading what's called the Road to Recovery initiative that grew out of this paper. And the other person I talked to was Jill Deppy, who's the head of the Audubon Society's migratory bird program. And so they both heard me being calling them up and asking them some really comically broad questions like, the state of migratory bird conservation today. And similar things to say. They both agreed that the time for data collection is not over. I think some people want to make the argument that at this point, obviously birds are in crisis. We need to stop spending all this money just gathering more and more and more and more data and start spending all of our money on conservation. But they both said, no, that is not the case. Because for a lot of these species, we still don't understand their migration and their migratory connectivity patterns in good enough detail to really know what we need to do to turn around these decline. They also both agreed that we need to get better at getting the data that we are collecting into the hands of people who can use policymakers and conservationists, and that we need to get better about working across international borders and incorporating partners from the social sciences, incorporating indigenous perspectives. And to my surprise, they both insisted that they feel hopeful about the future of migratory birds. And so I want to end by reading a little bit of what Pete Mara said to me when I asked him this question. He said, I'm very optimistic. We've done this in the past. We've corrected other environmental issues like the ozone layer, for instance. We haven't 100% fixed it, but we've come together and made it a lot better. And now we have to deal with climate change. So while it seems like there's this overwhelming deluge of negative issues and challenges of getting people on board with these things and constant pressures on nature, I choose to be optimistic and hopeful because I just don't see any benefit of being pessimistic or having a lack of hope. I just don't choose to take that route. Don't get me wrong, there are times when I might be negative or spiraling down into a pit of agony, but I'm not going to do that. So I don't know about you guys, but when I find myself spiraling down into a pit of agony, I usually just go burning. So